The Valorian space station hung in the void like a crystalline monument to bureaucratic excess. Inside its grand ceremonial chamber, 12 species sat in careful hierarchical arrangement, each one convinced of their own superiority. The Relic Blade rested on a pedestal in the center, looking exactly like what it was. An ancient hunk of metal that had somehow convinced an entire galaxy it was profound. High Arbiter Kess, a towering Talarian with skin that shimmered like oil on water, gestured dramatically toward the weapon. His species had been the keepers of the blade for 3,000 years, which meant they'd spent 3,000 years boring everyone else with stories about it. The blade, according to Talarian scripture, possessed the ability to judge any warrior through simple skin contact. Touch it, and the blade would glow for the worthy, darken for the cowardly, and hum with approval for the truly exceptional. It had never, in recorded history, remained silent. The fact that it had never actually been scientifically tested seemed irrelevant to everyone involved. Commander Vex of the Zolothian Empire lounged in his seat like he'd already won something. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world, and it showed in their muscular frames and their complete inability to make jokes about anything. Vex had appointed himself as proof of his people's superiority. He had 17 military decorations, a laugh that sounded like grinding metal, and the personality of a tax audit conducted by someone who hated taxes and audit trails equally. "Today," Kess announced in his formal, unnecessarily slow way, "we witness the judgment of Commander Vex's hand-picked champion. Allow me to present to you Krell the Unstoppable." Krell was in fact quite stoppable to anyone paying attention, but he was also 7 feet tall with teeth that could cut diamond and muscles on top of muscles, so nobody mentioned this. The warrior stepped forward with a confidence that suggested he'd never experienced doubt, failure, or introspection. His hand approached the blade with the kind of reverence typically reserved for holy relics, which technically it was. The moment his fingers made contact, the blade erupted. It glowed brilliant purple, humming a resonance that made everyone's teeth itch. Kess nodded sagely, though he'd seen this exact same reaction maybe 50 times already. Vex smirked, like a man who'd just confirmed that his favorite sports team remained undefeated. The other council members exchanged glances that suggested they were all thinking the same thing. How much longer until we can leave? The blade's judgment was complete. Krell was worthy. Krell was strong. Krell would probably win at arm wrestling too. Nobody was shocked. In fact, the whole thing had the feel of watching a weather forecast that never changed. Accurate, predictable, and fundamentally useless. But then everything got weird, which is what happens when you introduce humans to a situation that's been operating smoothly on assumptions for 3 millennia. Captain Jake Meridian stood waiting for his cue, mentally rehearsing the compliments he'd paid to all the various alien dignitaries he'd met over the past few hours. He'd learned that most sentient species responded well to the observation that their exoskeletons or scales or bioluminescent organs were, quote, really working for them. It had solved most of his diplomatic problems so far. Humanity had joined the Galactic Council exactly 8 months ago, which meant they'd spent those 8 months proving they could show up on time, not start any wars they couldn't finish, and generally act like they understood how advanced civilization worked. It was a low bar, and Jake was determined to clear it, metaphorically speaking. The literal bar situation varied between species. When High Arbiter Kess announced that a human representative would now be tested by the blade, the reaction was immediate and universal, barely concealed laughter. The Trilaxian delegation actually looked at each other and grinned. The Vesper Collective made sounds that probably translated to giggling. Even Kess's expression suggested he was doing humanity a favor by allowing them to participate, like inviting a toddler to a chess tournament just to see what would happen. Commander Vex leaned over to his adjacent seat occupant, a nervous-looking Quill diplomat, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "The test will be over in seconds. The blade will likely reject the specimen entirely. This should be educational for the younger members of the council, a lesson in limitations." Jake smiled at this. He was good at smiling through things. He'd grown up in a lower-middle-class suburb of Toronto and had learned to navigate social situations by being the guy who didn't take anything seriously. It was a strategy that translated surprisingly well to alien politics. Thanks for the encouragement, Commander, Jake called out, not bothering to wait for Kess to formally introduce him. I promise to try my best at this ancient warrior ritual that I'm sure is definitely not going to be weird at all. Several council members looked scandalized. Apparently, casual irreverence wasn't part of the ceremonial protocol. Vex's expression suggested Jake had just committed a war crime by existing. Captain Meridian, Kess began, his tone suggesting he was addressing a particularly slow child. The blade measures your essence as a warrior. Simply place your palm against the surface and remain still. The judgment will be instantaneous and absolute. Jake approached the blade with the kind of casual confidence that comes from genuinely not understanding the stakes. He'd been briefed that this was a test of some kind, but in his experience, tests were things you passed by either knowing the answer or faking it well enough that nobody noticed. He figured the blade probably fell into the second category. Let me guess, Jake said, examining the weapon closely. This thing costs, what, a couple million credits? Maybe refurbished? Nice patina on it, very vintage. Really screams ancient judgment weapon. Could use some linseed oil, though. Bring out the grain. Vex's eye twitched. That was excellent. Jake was already winning at this game. Jake turned to the waiting assembly of aliens, shrugged in a way that somehow communicated both awareness of and complete disregard for their expectations, and placed his hand firmly on the blade. Nothing happened. The silence that followed wasn't the kind of quiet that happens in a room. It was the kind of quiet that happens inside your skull when your brain suddenly stops processing information correctly. 12 species, some of whom had been in various states of mild contempt, suddenly snapped into perfect focus like meerkats catching a predator's scent. The blade remained exactly as it was. No glow, no darkness, no mysterious humming. Not a single photon of ethereal light. Not the faintest vibration. The weapon was so completely, utterly, catastrophically unresponsive that it somehow became the most significant thing in the history of Valorian Space Station. Jake looked down at his hand still touching the surface and waited for something to happen. When nothing did, he tried lifting his hand and placing it back down. Still nothing. He tried different fingers. Same complete absence of response. He even tried the other hand, which he would later describe as probably unnecessary but felt worth attempting at the time. Well, Jake said, breaking the silence that seemed to be developing an independent personality. I have to say I'm slightly disappointed. I was expecting either validation or dramatic rejection. This is like going to get a haircut and the barber just pretending you don't exist. High Arbiter Kess had gone very still. His bioluminescent skin had started doing this weird, flickering thing that Jake's translator app helpfully informed him meant profound disturbance. The other council members were beginning to make sounds in their various native languages, all of which seemed to be variations on the theme of, oh no. Commander Vex stood up. That was a first. Jake had watched Vex for 7 straight hours during orientation briefings, and the man had not once changed his sitting position. Now, he was on his feet, and his expression suggested he'd just witnessed a violation so profound that it required vertical positioning. This is a malfunction, Vex announced. The blade is clearly damaged. The test is invalid. Humanity proves itself incapable of even basic ceremonial participation. A female Talarian council member, whose name Jake's translation device insisted was something like Silvax the Observant, made a sound that translated to gentle disagreement. The blade has not malfunctioned in our records for 12,000 years, Commander. It is unlikely that it would choose this moment to fail. Then the human has somehow contaminated it, Vex countered. Primitive biology, corrupting ancient technology. Jake raised his hand. Just to clarify, I showered this morning, so if there's contamination, it's extremely fresh and well hydrated. Captain Meridian, Kess said slowly, his flickering intensifying into what might have been a light show or might have been a medical emergency. The blade is functioning perfectly. We have confirmed this. What it is doing is unique. You mean it's not doing anything? Jake asked. Exactly, Kess replied. In all recorded history, the Relic Blade has always responded. It has never encountered a subject and remained completely, utterly silent. The implications began to settle over the chamber like fog rolling into a graveyard. This was, Jake was beginning to understand, a much bigger deal than he'd anticipated. He'd assumed that being selected as humanity as representative to an ancient alien judgment ceremony was basically ceremonial. Turns out it was the opposite of ceremonial. It was unprecedented. It was impossible. "So, I broke your weapon?" Jake asked. "You did not break it," Kes said. "You contaminated it," Vex demanded. "I took a shower." "You confused it," a small reptilian ambassador suggested, "by existing." The chamber descended into carefully controlled chaos, which is what sophisticated alien diplomacy looks like when things go spectacularly wrong. 3 days later, Jake was sitting in what he could only describe as a very high-tech examination room, watching scientists from 5 different species poke the blade with instruments that didn't seem to be designed for poking things. One of them was a floating crystal from the luminescence collective that kept vibrating at frequencies Jake could feel in his teeth. Another was a creature that was mostly tentacles, which had the advantage of being able to hold multiple instruments simultaneously. "The weapon is functioning nominally," the lead scientist, a Vesper named Kronos, reported to the gathered council members. "All internal mechanisms are responding to stimuli. Energy reserves are optimal. There is no evidence of corruption, damage, or degradation." "Then test it again with the human," Kes instructed. Jake had been tested with the blade 7 times now. Each time with the same result: perfect, complete, unambiguous silence. They tested him after food, before food, after meditation, after vigorous exercise. And once after, he'd argued loudly with a Zelothian diplomat about whether action movies from Earth constituted art or warfare documentation. The blade remained profoundly unimpressed in all scenarios. They'd also tested 3 other humans just to confirm that it wasn't Jake specifically. A xenobiologist named Dr. Paula Morrison touched it and got silence. A logistics officer named Chen touched it and got silence. A maintenance technician named Rodriguez touched it and got absolute 0 response. The pattern was irrefutable. Humanity, as a species, was apparently immune to the blade's judgment mechanism. The Xylothian contingent had called an emergency session. Commander Vex was pushing hard for humanity's immediate expulsion from the Council, arguing that any species that could not be properly evaluated by the blade represented a security risk so profound that allowing them to remain was essentially a declaration of war by incompetence. Jake was in a holding area when High Arbiter Kes requested a private meeting. The Talarian looked tired. Jake's translator assured him that Talarians didn't technically experience tiredness, but if they did, Kes would have looked like it had just thrown a party in his nervous system. "Walk with me," Kes said, gesturing for Jake to follow. They moved through the station's corridors toward a section Jake hadn't seen before, past security checkpoints that seemed designed more for intimidation than actual protection. Eventually, they reached a library that looked like every library that had ever existed, just translated into architectural decisions that made more sense to beings with more sensory organs than humans. "The blade was created 8,000 years ago," Kes explained, moving between shelves of crystalline data storage. "At that time, my people had conquered the nearest star systems and found them inhabited by warriors just like us, just like the Zelothians, just like every species the Council now contains. Creatures of honor in combat and the drive to dominate." Jake nodded, following along. "The blade was designed to evaluate that quality," Kes continued. "To measure the potential for greatness in combat, the willingness to sacrifice for victory, the hunger for power and dominion. Every warrior in the galaxy shares this, some more than others. But the fundamental drive exists in all species of sufficient complexity to be worth testing. But not humans," Jake ventured. "But not humans," Kes confirmed. "The blade has tried to evaluate you. It has encountered your minds and your spirits, and it found something it cannot categorize. You are creatures of contradictions. You are simultaneously capable of profound violence and inexplicable mercy. You will sacrifice everything for your tribe, and then question why you did it. You are driven by impulses that contradict each other so fundamentally that our measuring systems cannot process you." "So we're just weird," Jake said. "You are genuinely, unpredictably, remarkably weird," Kes agreed. "And that is why the blade remains silent. It cannot judge what it cannot comprehend." The emergency council session was called for the following morning. Jake arrived to find the chamber in a state of controlled tension that suggested everyone had agreed to pretend nothing was wrong, while also preparing for total warfare. Commander Vex sat rigidly in his seat, surrounded by his personal security detail, all of whom looked like they'd been designed in a laboratory specifically to solve problems by being extremely large and aggressive at them. Jake was given a spot at a temporary podium, which he noticed had slightly less impressive decorative elements than the permanent council positions. Symbolism through furniture, apparently. Vex stood first. His argument was logical, coherent, and deeply flawed, which made it dangerous because people with power tend to prefer arguments that are wrong but confident. He presented the blade's silence as evidence of human dangerousness. A species that could not be judged, could not be trusted. A species that defied the ancient measurement systems, represented a fundamental threat to the existing order. Humanity should be expelled, isolated, or preferably both. When Vex finished, several council members nodded along. The Zelothian way of thinking had appealed to warrior species. It was simple. It made sense if you weren't paying attention. Jake was invited to respond. He stepped up to the podium and decided to abandon every diplomatic briefing he'd received. Those briefings had all been written by people who had never met an actual human. Commander Vex is right about one thing, Jake began. We can't be judged by the blade. We can't be categorized the way you categorize yourselves. You're all looking at that and seeing a threat. I'm looking at it and seeing a strength. He paused, letting that settle. Here's what I understand about the blade. It measures violence potential, combat willingness, the drive to dominate. That's useful if you're trying to predict how someone will act in war. But what if someone doesn't act like a warrior? What if someone can be ruthless and compassionate, aggressive and thoughtful, driven and doubtful, all at the same time? Vex leaned forward, about to interrupt. Jake kept talking. Humans are chaos agents. We'll invent new solutions you didn't predict. We'll cooperate and compete simultaneously. We'll follow rules until the moment we decide we shouldn't, and then we'll create new rules. The blade can't judge us because we don't fit into the framework. And yeah, that makes us harder to predict, but it also makes us harder to beat. You can't defeat what you can't categorize. The chamber was silent in a way that seemed productive, rather than terrified. Every species here was measured by the blade, Jake continued. That measurement told you something about yourself, but it also locked you into expectations. Vex will always be a warrior. Kess will always be wise. You'll all play the roles the blade assigned. Humans don't have that limitation. We can be anything because we're everything. Silvax the Observant was nodding slowly. Several other council members looked thoughtful in their various ways. So, what are you proposing? Kess asked carefully. That maybe the blade's silence is the best judgment it could have given, Jake replied. That a species you can't predict isn't a threat, it's an asset. That being unjudgeable isn't a liability, it's a superpower. Vex stood up again, his eye twitching with renewed intensity. This is absurd. We cannot base council policy on the opinion of a species that has existed in the galaxy for less than a year. No, Kess said quietly, but we can base it on 12,000 years of precedent. The blade has never been silent. The blade has never failed to render judgment, until now, until humans. That is not a malfunction, Commander. That is a message. The vote took 47 minutes because alien democracy apparently involved everyone expressing their position through elaborate speeches and ritualistic disagreement. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Humanity was granted full council status. The blade was formally documented as satisfied with its silence regarding human warriors. Jake made a joke about the blade needing a software update. Nobody laughed, but Kess made that flickering expression again, which probably counted as the Talarian equivalent of amusement. Vex stormed out, which everybody agreed was probably for the best. 3 weeks later, Jake and Kess were standing in front of the blade together. The weapon looked exactly the same as it always had, which seemed appropriate for something that was supposed to be profound. The Talarian was examining it with an expression of what might have been satisfaction, or might have been indigestion. Humanity has disrupted a system that was stable for 12,000 years, Kess observed. How does your species feel about that? Honestly, we're pretty used to disrupting things, Jake admitted. It's kind of our main talent. We show up, we don't understand the rules, we accidentally break everything, and then somehow it works out better. It's become a pattern. Kess made that flickering expression again. That was definitely amusement. Jake was getting better at reading Talarians. The Council has approved your species for a military alliance, Kess said. We are preparing for a conflict with the Outer Dark, entities from beyond the known systems. They are predictable. They are disciplined. They are everything the Blade would have judged as supremely dangerous. And you want humanity because we're chaos agents, Jake finished. We want humanity because you are solutions we have not considered, Kess corrected. The Blade's silence has become your credentials. Jake looked at the ancient weapon and felt a strange moment of connection with it. The Blade had tried to judge humanity using the framework of 8,000 years of warfare and strategy and warrior honor. And when that didn't work, it had stayed silent. Not because humans failed to register, but because humans registered in a way the system couldn't process. That seemed exactly right somehow. So what happens to the Blade now? Jake asked. We preserve it, Kess said. As a reminder that judgment systems are only useful if you understand what you are measuring. The galaxy assumed it understood everything important about warriors. The Relic Blade proved that assumption incomplete. From the corridor outside the chamber, they could hear Commander Vex's security detail making their way toward the landing docks. The Zilothian had decided that Valorian Space Station was no longer compatible with his personality, and had requested a transfer to the Outer Territories. Everyone was handling his departure with the diplomatic equivalent of trying very hard not to smile. Jake extended his hand one more time toward the blade, just to confirm. The weapon remained perfectly, completely, absolutely silent. It was the best judgment Jake had ever received, and it came from a tool designed to judge him by standards his people had never tried to meet. Come on, Kess said, placing a tentacle around Jake's shoulder in what the human recognized as surprising affection. The Council wants to discuss your species' potential role in the Outer Dark conflict. There are strategy sessions scheduled. You will have much to contribute. As they left the chamber, Jake grinned. Humanity had spent the last 8 months trying to prove it belonged in the galaxy. It turned out all they'd needed to do was be completely, unpredictably, fundamentally themselves, and maybe break something ancient in the process. The blade remained on its pedestal, silent and satisfied, a living monument to the fact that sometimes judgment isn't about being measured. Sometimes it's about being accepted precisely because you cannot be measured. Behind them, the ancient weapon sat in perfect, profound, world-altering silence. It had never worked this well before,